Hello, and welcome to the second webinar in our three-part series, Power Building, Making Community Engagement Transformative. Why power building? Again, I'm sure you're asking. We're focusing on power building in service of equity and justice. At Community Science, we prioritize the advancement of equity and justice, and we do this through our work with our clients, which include government agencies, nonprofit organizations, philanthropic organizations, and we do this by providing quality research, evaluation, and the capacity building supports that we offer in service of equity and justice in order to move this work forward. But today we will continue the conversation about making community engagement transformational using power building strategies. We will review the ways to support power building strategies. And then our panelists will share with you about their experiences using power building strategies from their different perspectives. And then we'll end today's conversation with a question and answer opportunity. Okay, welcome once again. I am Jasmine Williams Washington, Associate at Community Science. I am an experienced community organizer that sees my current role as a change agent in the service of equity and social justice. To do this, I support organizations in telling stories through data and communicate in order to communicate the impact of their power building work. Today, I have the pleasure of co-hosting today's panel discussion with my colleague, David Chavis, CEO and Principal Associate at Community Science. David?
Great, thank you. And thank you, Jasmine, and thank you everyone for being here, and thank you to the panelists. My background is that before being involved with community science, I started my career as a community organizer, as we were just talking, and in Buffalo, New York, and I've worked as an organizer in Appalachia, where I've worked as a trainer and several other cities as well as a trainer and coach for organizers. In the last 25 years, as we've worked into consulting and evaluation, we've worked with foundations, nonprofits, and government agencies that wanted to go under the empowering communities or power building banner, but have not really been prepared for it and kind of treating it as another program, as Chevron called it, and not realizing that this is not a program, this is a movement that takes a different approach. And so we felt as there's now a resurgence of interest, we don't want to continue to make the mistakes that foundations, nonprofits, and governments have been making over these last years, to start off with the same, as if they were the first one to do it, and that not aware that this is a whole nother approach to doing work, either as a philanthropy or as a nonprofit or as a government agency. And that takes another paradigm approach. And we wanted to have a conversation and continue in the second part of this series, keeping it real and really being able to talk very directly about the challenges, the issues, and not try to make it as everything, just a little tinkering has to be going on. Because by shifting power, it means you have to, as you'll hear, you have to be the change you want to see. And that comes a lot harder. It's easy to advise others to do it than to do it yourselves. And I hope that we all get to be able to talk about how, if we're going to approach this work seriously and really make a difference, how we're going to do it differently now. So thank you all for the time. And Jasmine, back to you.
Thanks, David. Today, we are pleased to have three panelists who represent varying perspectives. Our first panelist brings over 16 years of community organizing experience. Chevron Chapman is the lead organizer for Working Together Jackson, an affiliate of IAF, the Industrial Areas Foundation, located in Jackson, Mississippi. Working Together Jackson is a broad-based coalition of institutions committed to collaborative strategies that solve many problems facing Jacksonians. Our next panelist is Jon Liss. He's the co-executive director of the New Virginia Majority, bringing over 30 years of experience in organizing for racial and social justice in Virginia. He served as an elected leader of Taxi Drivers Association, and he co-founded the Tenants and Workers United, a low-income racial and gender justice organization. Our last panelist is Danielle Shoots. Before joining community science, Danielle served as Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of the Colorado Trust. Some of her responsibilities included forecasting and due diligence of program-related investments and monitoring key performance indicators. So she is the person to talk about making that case to, right? Um, and that's where we are. So, but before we get started today, I just want to take a moment and revisit our last session. So, for those of you who are able to take the time to view that, thank you so much for doing so. And for those of you who have not yet had the opportunity to catch the recording, there was a lot of great conversation there. So, when you have time, just give it a play. Anyway, in the previous webinar, we examined what transformative community engagement is, the components of power, and how you can support power building strategies like transformative community engagement. So we start here because typically how to support is typically where people become stuck, and we want to move you from being stuck to moving to action, right? So take a look at our equity and justice table here. And I just want to highlight a couple of the chairs. So on the left side of the table, I want to highlight, be prepared for internal conflict. It will come. Whenever power is on the table, there is bound to be some kind of conflict, some kind of resistance. Let's get prepared to actually answer that call when it happens. Next, be the change you want to see. David mentioned in his opening comments, like, hey, this is not a program, this is a movement. We have to be committed to this work. And by doing that, you are working to establish the practices and those policies needed within your organization in order to fully commit to a power building strategy. It is certainly not something we can virtue signal for and check all the boxes, but not move it forward, because we will know that it was not a genuine, authentic effort, and the community will also sense that as well. Next, hey, create a safe and brave space for the people that you're working with to actually do this work. Again, it is not easy. This is not a strategy and a movement that is going to be met with, oh, roses from everyone. It's not necessarily going to be that way. So ensure that you're creating the environment needed so that a power building strategy is not only bought in by from the community, but is sustainable, ultimately leading to systemic and sustainable change in the community to actually get get more equitable communities everywhere. David, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I always have something, you know that. So I think that today's thought is, I would add, and just having a cool phrase is not enough. Okay, that's just the first step. I would just add that, and I think everybody knows what it is. You can say you have trust-based philanthropy, community-driven philanthropy, power building, but that's just your first thought, and then the fun begins. So I just wanted to add that your job only begins with the name, not ends.
Thank you. All right, and I think we're ready to get started for the grand event and the reason why everyone's here. And so we're at this time, we're going to stop sharing our slides just so that you're able to see the panel. Um, and to our panelists, just an opening question for everyone on the call, and starting with Siobhan, if needed. Again, this is a conversation. So as things are mentioned today, uh, feel free to drop it in the chat. We are here to keep it real and to answer all of the things that you may have to question about this process. But Siobhan and our other panelists, why should foundations, nonprofits, um, any of these agencies uh, actually take the risk and invest in power building strategies in the communities that they're working in?
Well, simply put, because it's worthwhile and it's a huge bang for your buck. Because we're talking about power building, we're talking about systems. And so we're then moving from, as a leader here, Bishop Kruta puts it, compassion work to justice work, and really putting teeth to those concepts, not just words. I just appreciated what I just heard. Let me just take a step back and say a little bit more about myself and what I do so that I can illustrate the point. I'm Chevron Chapman. I'm a lead organizer. We're Working Together Jackson, which is an affiliate of the Industrial Areas Foundation. IAF is 80 years old. It's the oldest organizing training institute in the country. And I see David smiling because he was referring to some experience with network as well. We have about 60 broad-based organizations around the country and some abroad. And the work that we do in broad-based organizing is that WCJ and others, Working Together Jackson and others, we build power, and we have institutional members that we, when IAF is invited into a community, help arrange themselves in such a way that they can take on the power structures that currently exist in their communities that they've decided don't work for them. Okay. And so it's a vehicle and a means to an end rather than an end within itself. If the mission is building power, and so it's very different from typical nonprofit work that typically has a, hey, we work on this, we work on childcare, and then let me be really clear. There's room, there's a necessity for all the good work that needs to be done, but all the good work that is being done on those fronts, but power building requires a different type of thinking. It requires, it takes into account, at least in our case, the myriad of interests. So broad-based organizing, when we say broad-based, we mean that these organizations consist of cross divisions of race, economic status, partisan line, political affiliations, and that's intentional because that's what's necessary to build power. It's about being relational with each other and having conversations and focusing on self-interest instead of the tribalist, instead of the Republican, Democrat, and all those other titles that cause people to clinch up in their cocoons with others. And so we work together toward the common good on that. And so then we're able to thus take on with more legitimacy and more capacity the various ills of the community. And so above all, my job is to teach power. Okay, my job is to teach power and make sure that people understand what it is and aren't scared of it, because so many of our communities are such. So I know I'm at time. I just wanted to give a little context because I want to illustrate just the point with the question about why it's worthwhile is because, these are things that are not, that can be countercultural when done in practice.
John or Danielle, would you like to bring your voice into the space? What makes investing in power building strategies worth it? Why should foundations and others alike invest in these types of strategies?
Yeah, it's interesting. I would have answered this question differently 10 years ago, maybe. I think it's risky at this stage of where we're at in this country to not invest in power building. At the root of our power, of our caste system in this country, of every inequity within our power system is us desiring as a country to be the greatest economic power in the world. That's at the root of all of it. And we are reaching a critical point in this country where by the year 2030, 50% of this fine country of ours will be people of color. And we have systems that don't operate any longer the way they've been operating when 50% of your population are people of color. And governments and foundations and nonprofits are going to be at the center of this sort of economic revolution I believe is coming. I believe it has to. We have a math equation. You can't have 50% of your population not accessing the economy, not accessing wealth building tools, even though it was designed for us not to all of these years. It has to change at this point. You can't have this many liabilities on the United States balance sheet. So I believe that we're at a point where from an economic power building perspective, we're going to have to do something different. And it's why I have so much hope. And I think folks who aren't making that investment in shifting power, in building wealth and creating economic mobility in a very systemic way, are actually the ones who are taking the risk, not the ones who are investing.
Yeah, I mean, I agree in the sense that it's definitely around power building. That's the lens at which we do our work. And that's, you know, organizing people, organizing money, organizing ideas that are really clear about creating conditions when working class women of color can thrive, that we know that's going to shift society in a way that actually everybody's going to be doing pretty well. And that I would frame this really as a distinction between charity and solidarity. So charity maintains a particular relationship, you know, it's dropping a quarter in the Salvation Army bucket, and that might buy somebody a Christmas toy, but it's not changing anything going on in our world in any significant way. And then solidarity is actually and I think charity in a certain way reinforces a disequal power relationship in terms of race and class and or gender. And I would just say that solidarity tries to turn that around and say, how are we building a movement together to shift and change this world that we all live in? And so that's a different relationship and a different sort of end result that you're trying to move to. And I think that's, you know, I don't know, your foundation may like opera, that's fine, but that's not the ones we're talking with are about, like, you know, and opera's fine. But it's really about how do we build relationships? What's the dynamic sort of alliances that need to be made between communities, funders, some elements of business, et cetera, to actually transform the society. So to me, that really is around solidarity and treating people, sort of your theory of knowledge and your practice is really thinking about people as equals, as co-creators of the new world we want to create.
I just want a follow-up question. That was just great. But I think I want just keeping it real, there's this flip side to this point, which is that when we talk about foundations, many nonprofits that are in maybe the human service mode, in that, you know, in the service providing mode, and then, you know, government agencies which represent, they're all really tied to they're generally risk-averse organizations, okay, and they're generally tied to larger structural power that is not rooted in the communities that we're working in. So one could ask, are they the right people to be asking? And is there really an alternative? Is the other side of that question. Okay, you know, given that, and that's going to be really the theme, do you go there, go in that situation? You know, we're going to talk about how to deal with that, but the basic question is, are they the right place to go? You know, and with that risk, is there an alternative even to the scale that's needed, given your compelling cases?
I mean, I just jumped in with a short part of the answer, which is, I mean, for us, it's sort of a prerequisite that we built up a certain amount of power in advance. So we're coming in there in a different relationship as opposed to with our tin cup out in front of us. And so I'll just give a real recent example in the south side of Richmond, 1,300 apartments that have been, you know, abused and in really horrific conditions for decades, but particularly the last few years with the pandemic. And we are trying to do just housing with dignity campaign and trying to get actually pretty basic stuff, don't evict folks during a pandemic, and bring everything up to code standards. Nothing major, and we could get nowhere. And then finally, and we were organizing people, we're doing some protests, we're doing social media work. We finally did got major coverage in the Richmond Times-Dispatch, the paper of record in Richmond. And all of a sudden we start getting phone calls returned and things start changing. And then more recently, we did a sort of larger protest with more allies, more pressure, more elected officials showing up. And, you know, up to this point, the major change that had happened is that they had hired 2 $500 an hour crisis consultants. So I guess 2 people gained out of this, but they weren't really changing the conditions. And then finally, after this most recent round of press and protests, we get the back channel word that they're willing to talk with us. And we respond saying, sure, we're happy to meet. It'll be some residents, us, blah, blah, blah. We're even willing to do this off the record to start the conversation. And so in 4 months, because we built a certain amount of power, in terms of the battle of ideas and the battle of organizing people, they said, okay, yes, we're willing to meet and let's have a conversation and keep this out of the press and talk about real solutions like we've been trying to do, which I would just, my side comment would be, well, you have been trying very hard for the last couple decades, but I guess you have been working, maybe that's the best you can do. So we're going to have this meeting going forward, but that was back in December. We were not in a relationship of any power in terms of the target and what we were trying to get done. 4 months later, we're in a different position, and it's really the people you've organized and how we've organized them that has sort of shifted that whole dynamic.
Any other thoughts on that?
I think of the, I don't see the three the same, David. So nonprofits, government, and philanthropy, I see as having very different roles in that. So if we did our own power mapping, just using those three people as an example, philanthropy is where the power is, because philanthropy is where the wealth is. So we, I think that our government is driving the economy. The economy drives the government. So for me, it is philanthropy has to play a huge role because of the amount of wealth that sits in philanthropy in actually doing systems change. They have to underpin nonprofits that are doing advocacy work, agitation work, power building work in a way that's very different, that doesn't just leverage their 5% charitable contribution, but leverages their wealth, which is actually the other 95% of their money that's sitting out in the stock market. So I think that if philanthropy will do that, it will push the government. I actually think the government waits for wealth to whisper in its ear. And so at the root of this is philanthropy or any wealth structure in this country needing to help be a part of a power building movement. And I think that's why we're a little stuck, because people think power is like pie and I have to give you my piece. And the truth is, if we build wealth, wealthy people are going to get wealthier, and people that don't have access to wealth are going to get wealthy.
I really appreciate you naming that, Danielle, because, and that's why I prefer to use the term power building as opposed to power shifting, because it kind of presupposes that there's this pie and that this is a zero-sum deal. And so, in the work of organizing, it's like, hey, we can build enough relational power, keep building as much possible power as we can, so that we can share and create, again, this alternate arrangement that can contend with the government, that can contend with the business sector, whose interests are very much at the table because of organized money. And so, we're having to, in our work, push back against the market, push back against government decisions that aren't in interest of people, in interest of citizens, of residents. The other piece I'll just name about the way we operate in IAF is that we raise our own money. We call it hard money. And one of our leaders here, Reverend Jimmy Edwards, says, because it's hard to raise, it's hard to come back, he say. And that's because we have a membership due structure. And we also have various campaigns and various in raising money with businesses. Our leaders go out and do that. And that is because, first of all, skin in the game changes a lot of things. The other piece is that we want to be independent and sustainable over time. At the end of the day, and we welcome philanthropy. Philanthropy has enabled us to hire more staff and hire more talent for organizing. However, we recognize that money can come and go, or interests change of those funders. And so coming to the table with power already built through organized people and organized money is a really key part of a serious conversation about getting funded.
Maybe I'll say some difference is that I feel like, you name your sport, whether it's whatever, but there's a field that's set up fundamentally like this. And based on sort of race, class, and gender dynamics, there's a bunch of folks that are running uphill all the time. And there's a bunch of folks going downhill all the time. And that's really the corporate and business interest. So I would just say, we're trying to figure out how to change that power dynamic, at least make it a level field, if not flowing the other way. So and I would say, if you look at the accumulation of wealth, whether it's Amazon or everybody else, it's deeply connected to rules and regulations, or lack of rules and regulations that are set up by government. So Amazon, I live 3 miles, maybe 2 miles from where the HQ2 Amazon's going to be. And they're coming there because they are literally about 200 yards away from the Pentagon, that at least up until recently, the pandemic may have changed the numbers, but up until recently, Amazon broke even on all the package delivery. They make their money off of government. Jeff Bezos is 146 or whatever $billion comes from actually some way indirectly from our tax money, right? It comes from the government. So I just want to say, folks are wealthy. You know, when a road is built in a certain way and it goes to a shopping mall and land and major property owners and they make money and somebody else doesn't, or when they build an environmental dump on top of a Black community, those are all governmental decisions that determine, you know, the quality of life and the wealth of different folks. I just want to say there's a real strong relationship between government and you know, government and wealth.
And I think those policies are bought and paid for by wealth. So it's a cycle, right? You know, that's how we get policies that are that friendly, or subsidies to an Amazon or to a Tesla, who would have never broken even without government subsidies in the market, but is now seen as the powerhouse of capitalism. So it's quite ironic.
Citizens United.
Citizens United.
Is a world of trouble and dark money and interests, special interests in our decision making. And last, just real quick, the one thing that I think needs to be named is, because what we're talking about is doing politics. And politics right now, rightfully so in some ways, gets a bad rap. Because of how dysfunctional it has been. But ultimately, the public sphere, politics was meant to help us be a place where we could negotiate and compromise based on our self-interest. And so what we aim to do, because we're not going to be, organized money is always going to be organized money. And it's always going to represent a certain capacity. And so where we can organize to really make good on this democracy that we can say that we live in, like that's the goal of the work, is to kind of be a David with that Goliath.
So mentioning like political and being political. So we know that nothing's apolitical, right? Like we want to tout those things. And so David mentioned earlier, what's your case? So thinking about that, to Danielle's point, hey, people view power like a piece of pie, and is not really, it's the idea of building power. From you all's perspectives, what is an example of a time that you successfully made the case for investing in building power building for a community? So, and then as you think about the audience, what was it about the audience, and does that case change? Are you providing concrete examples inside of that case to be the evidence for why to invest in power building as a part of the work, from whatever capacity that you're sitting?
Yeah, so, you know, I'll give a really concrete example. A lot of our investment work when I was at the trust for me was around this exact dynamic, and how do we leverage our dollars differently as a philanthropy in a power building movement. And it is really hard work to do that, but I can do one example that worked, which was that we had 24 rural local media newspapers that were coming up for sale. The seller was retiring finally. And so the power of local narrative in our work, if you're doing power building, is huge. And the one buyer on the block in Colorado was a buyer we would not have wanted to buy these newspapers up. We would have lost the truth of our rural communities. We would have lost the truth of our racial divide. And we were really nervous about that, but that's not something you can just make a grant to and fix, right? And so what we did was leverage the balance sheet of the Colorado Trust, technically became a co-signer on the purchase. Not a dollar ever left our door for this. We just leveraged our balance sheet, which is huge. That's the 95% I'm talking about, not the 5% that goes out in charity. And basically became a co-signer on the purchase through a bridge loan that allowed for that to remain local, with some local folks putting together dollars in order to keep the media local, keep the people employed who would have not been employed. We knew the buyer would have completely centralized all of the reporters and all of the narrative, quite frankly, in Colorado, where we have so much of our population that we need to make sure we're hearing from. And so we leveraged the balance sheet and never paid a dollar. To my point about it not being pie, we gave up nothing. We just leveraged what we had available to us from the system to do that work. And so that's an example of certain things that we worked. PPP loans during COVID. We took out loans, got 1% interest because we have these huge balance sheets, and pushed that through to nonprofits at the same rate. Where they would have went to a bank and got, an 8% rate versus a 1% interest rate, things like that, to keep capital moving through the system differently, and allowing people to actually move and flex without us really doing cash out the door. And I think there's so much room for philanthropy to grow and move in that space, and leveraging what I call our 95% in this work, which is the actual systems work there. And the conversation's hard. What I say to an investment committee who's managing an endowment of $600 million, I think the thing that I've said that actually hit and got folks around the table to understand this conversation, especially investors, is we have built an entire infrastructure called this foundation to deploy 5%, to deploy $20 million or $30 million, depending on where we're at, a year. And then we have an endowment where maybe 5% of that is invested in things that are completely counterproductive to the work that we've built an entire infrastructure to do. And to me, that's just one of the greatest American gaslights. So we have to think about it differently. And $20 million in a big pharma is going to do a lot more damage than we can reverse with 5% in health equity work, right? And so I think thinking about it that way, and the dollars and cents behind it, is really important when talking to a board and talking to an investment committee, or talking to people who do hold power.
Thank you. So thinking about making the case for investing in power building, and Danielle shared from a funder's perspective and doing it that way. I'm curious to know, what are things, as someone that's seeking funding, what things have been important for you all to share in order for the funder to, from your vantage point, and Siobhan or John can take this, that actually got the funder to really see the big picture, why this is important, why power building is important. And I really do appreciate the business case that Danielle has brought.
Most funders want to see some proof of track record or capacity toward achieving goals set out. And it does help to be a part of a network that has a credential and a history of some very critical victories in various places. Funders also want to see skin in the game. That's something impressive to them. Like I said, raising money on our own, but I also want to name, just when we talk about power building and relational power building, the fact that we're not just acting, but teaching people about power, and simply the capacity to act, and pulling people out of their stereotypes and aversions about power and politics, and really, and I call myself a chief enabler, really enabling the work instead of really other things like that. That's attractive because it gets to the goal of wins and victories, but it is an engagement. And engagement is a critical part of power building. This is not simply, and there's a space for activism, but this is an activism. This is slow, patient work that Ella Baker talked about, of working with, of having conversations with people, understanding their interests, understanding their heartbreaks, and bringing that forth to the table and teaching them, and not just the usual suspects. I'm quick to say I'm a usual suspect, right? And the usual suspects are those folks who are, have a certain amount of privilege, frankly, can show up here, they're here, we're there, they have a credential, they may have a background, PhD, I have a JD, people who are, in my view, too heavily leaned upon to fix our problems. Right? This is an inviting and a deep engagement of whoever. And now, when I'm in an institution, I say I'm not looking just for you to send a representative to the meeting. Like, I want to engage who's answering the phones, who's cleaning the floors, because they all have stories. They all have families and histories that need to be brought to the table. And so I think that funders are attracted to the breadth of the reach of the work and how we think about humans and the human experience in the grand scheme of building power.
Thank you for that, Siobhan. What I'm curious about is what types of information, what is the information? So while funders, in your experience, you're having to provide that evidence, how many people in the relationship aspect, how do you communicate that slow burn and that slow burn to the funders so that they understand this is a part of the power building work?
This way I'm typically describing it to you is how I'm really frankly passing it on to them. And because there are really we're having conversations with grant makers beforehand, and then that leads to the application process because there's context to give, and so context we provide. It would misrepresent what I do if it's the same way I decided to kind of give a little context on the front end of this, maybe too much. We have to take and I think that's instructive for folks who are seeking grants. Like, we have to make our case. We have to tell our story, and not to say that we don't answer the questions, but we have to frame this in such a way that takes into account the interests of our funders, but also brings forth, hey, this is something, like, brings forth our story. If we're just trying to fit into into something, like, I think it's a disservice. I hope that helps. Maybe John can maybe has a better answer for you.
Not a better answer. I'll give just the example of how we talked about it was a 10-year process, which I'll spare you the details. Residents of a neighborhood it was 300 apartments getting eviction notices to becoming limited equity cooperative owners. And it was a 10-year campaign and process. And so the message to the residents is the politics of permanence, how to prevent not having to worry about evictions over your head at any given moment. This is a collective purchase as a cooperative. The message to, in this case, it was the city of Alexandria in Virginia, the message was really small. Their mindset is through home ownership. So we talked about 300 little homeowners. I mean, it's a cooperative, it's different, but we talked in terms of home ownership and having that level of control, and people investing in the community and the residual benefits that trickle out from that. And then in terms of funders, really it's a conversation, I view it almost like venture capital in the sense of, it's high risk. I mean, trying to go, if you told us from getting eviction notices and driving the company into bankruptcy, and then 10 years later, creating a cooperative, that's a bad investment. You can look around the room, you don't want to put your own money in that, but it's sort of like venture capital. The return is huge. So we were getting, say $50,000 grants, pocketing them for 5-7 years, a little bit of money here and there. And in the end, $20 million worth of property is moved to resident, which is basically 100% people of color, working class communities of color, owning 100% of about 300 apartments. And it became also stability for the entire neighborhood in terms of gentrification. When you had enough people that were sort of, long-term residents, it made it harder to move out the rest of the neighborhood. So for a foundation, our view is this is the vision we're selling, and it's not guaranteed. We have a plan there. We have this sort of process. We built a certain amount of power, but it's not guaranteed. But on the other hand, the return is huge, and it actually gives every year. If you do the math on it, it's in terms of what people pay for ownership as opposed to rent, they're saving, $3 million a year. So it just gives forever. So that was like this sort of argument on just a financial term. And the joke about it, when we were going to the bank to get the money, I made an argument around sweat equity. They were going to give us the equity and we were going to make them sweat, but that's not the best argument.
Can I jump just real quick it occurs to me, really the ideal request that we're making with funders is to invest in talent. And it's the talent of the organizer that is trained and developed to identify leaders and develop leaders around their interests and guide them through the work of building power, which is different than most operations, again, that are programmatic. And so and I'm thinking about a grant in particular that we have for our living wage. We are building a living wage intermediary, and we have a grant toward that, but the funder understands or has arrived to understanding that that this is really about investing in the people who are going to do it, that are going to pass on these skills, pass on these capacities, so that the work can live on far beyond the moment of a particular campaign.
Thank you. Thank you. I just want to pause for a minute. Thank you all for your input, but we do have a question from the audience around how to start and build relationships. So from where you all are sitting, how would you all advise government agencies or foundations to, or nonprofit, to identify different community groups that they should work with to begin building those relationships in the community? And what should that contact look like? How would you approach that situation?
I'm biased, right? I'm an IF organizer, so, and I believe in the method, but I would say, and because this just really gets, I think, at the answer to the question, organizations that are about action and power building, that have a deep engagement structure, a deep engagement process. And for example, in our work, we do relational meetings and house meetings. My number one job is to meet with people and talk with them in one-on-one or in small group settings that enable us for those patterns and self-interest and issues to come forth and look for leaders. And so like, that's really what I would recommend to funders. Look for folks who are engaging people deeply on their interests, and not, let me not do the not thing. Let's just leave it a period right there, because what gets missed, it can be easily, things can easily masquerade. I'll just say that.
John, Danielle or John, from a nonprofit perspective, or another funder or government perspective, how would you advise them to get started?
I mean, my short answer would be, I'd look at Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator, and say, how do you create dialogue or communication? So you're not coming in with all the answers, but you're actually having authentic conversation and dialogue and back and forth. And neither they have all the answers nor you have all the answers. So trying to create that authentic space is sort of important. I mean, think of late, at times in our organizing past, often when we get started, there's more of a confrontational relationship. And at times, and sometimes it takes years to get a different set of players in there, the relationship can change in a different way. And you can start developing an appreciation for, like, yeah, there's a lot of good ideas. In fact, probably the correct ideas come from the people most impacted by whatever problem, in this case, often housing or what have you.
Yeah, and I agree with what John and Chevron said about investing in talent. That is what and it's like, that's what venture capital does too, right? You could have a great idea, but you're investing in the team, the person who's going to have to make that idea come to life. And that's how you grow and scale something and build power in that way. And so I think to start with understanding who already has power in their community, right? And how do you understand who those people are, and building relationships with those leaders who just need an investment in themselves to carry the message. I think the other thing foundations have to do, like, don't start with a power map of community, start with a power map of yourself. And be really transparent about that. Hey, like, this is where power sits in our organization, and this is who has the most power, and this is what we don't know, and this is where we're messing it up, and this is where we're falling down, and sort of sharing that vulnerability with the community in order to create trust, because I think trust is so big. You have to be willing to tell the story in the ways that you got it wrong, especially when you hold as much power as funders do, right? Like, that dynamic is so real from a positional power perspective. So I think being able to create trust in community, if you truly and authentically are trying to build power and trying to listen to what the community thinks is best.
So go ahead, David.
Yeah, I was going to jump in and say, first, I just wanted to say they haven't gone through again, like coaching folks just this morning on presenting to boards. I think Dee gives a great example of how we have to translate our language and speak to be able to speak to wealth and power in terms they understand and they can relate to, without feeling like we're co-opting our mission and values. And I think it is that kind of conversation. What is their self-interest in this that we try to identify in that? What is it they hope? Because we're doing the right thing. It's just putting it in a frame. We're not asking compromise. We're just trying to translate to their world. It's a translation, not a co-optation. There's a difference too. And the second thing is just concretely that we found is that, you know, picking up on Charles Lee's question, if you have already relationships, build upon them. I think Siobhan's point about the house meeting is the foundation version of the house meeting. You know one person, you know one group, you speak to them. Who's doing power building in the community? Who else should I speak to? It's building out and starting to ask and getting out there and having conversations, having the version of house meetings with people in the community and leaders to ask them who's doing the work, because we don't really spend a lot of time on that, building those relationships, because it is ultimately all about relationships as well.
And just I appreciate all comments, and we're just flowing right along toward you said, David and Danielle, you mentioned the trust, and it just got me thinking about the respect factor in this as well. When I say respect, I mean, for example, in the work that in the broad-based organizing work that I do, like, again, I said I'm an enabler in chief. That means that there are certain things that are in my lane, but I'm coming to a community as a broad-based organizer with the respect for the knowledge and expertise of the people who are living through the pressures that we're seeking to address. In a place like Mississippi, I've seen it over and over where folks come in from elsewhere and they helicopter in when crises occur, and if we want to talk real, right, David? And you know, they're applying for all these funds to help these poor Black folk or whoever who has been affected, and they feel like, okay, I have the best answer, I have this and that. Like, that's, if we're gonna start making a list of red flags or at least yellow flags, right? Be really mindful of where these folks are coming from and how well they're engaging with the community, and trusting the people on the ground to understand their situations and what they have to say about outsiders in their space.
Right. Yeah, the long-term, great point. And it's a long-term commitment, and it's really about the a genuine relationship that's been built, not one about bringing in McKinsey to start doing community organizing.
Right. So we've heard a lot from everyone about relationships and trust and authenticity when we talk about relationships and the relationship with community, regardless of where you're from. So I'm wondering, what I'm sitting with right now is, how do you push back? How do you push back when the issues, the priorities identified by the community are not in alignment with the funder or your board or your leaders? How do you handle those types of things? Because here it is, where, you know, everyone is in agreement, power building is needed. It is to create equitable communities everywhere, right? And sustainable systemic change. But when we do that in a very meaningful and authentic way, by doing this taking a power building approach, when there is conflict between what one side wants over the other, the funder versus the community, or even you as a nonprofit organization with your board, when those things are in conflict, how do you push back? How do you lean into being the change that you want to see? I see David. David, you're gonna unmute.
Yeah, I was gonna say, and get the foundation to be the change they said they want to see.
Yes.
Not to really push the thing, or the nonprofit, like there was the term flipping around, right?
Thank you. When a foundation has wholly incompatible goals, I just want to start there. We're not gonna try to, again, try to stick around circle to a square. However, I'm terrible with expressions, but y'all know what I'm saying. However, where there is because even with funders, this is, you know, in terms of power building and relation, it's not just with the organization and the folks on the ground, but really even with funders, creating that relational, that space where we can have honest conversations, a relationship that says, hey, you know, this is, let's frame this a little bit differently. If you feel like they're open to it. I've had conversations with funders and have had to say, this is the reality. I know you want to look at it this way, but ultimately thinking about the funder's interests, this makes more sense in terms of an approach based on what we know about how this operates, and also based on what we're seeing on the ground. And, you know, all that means that all lanes, people, we all have our lanes, right, are respected and vindicated in that conversation, in that process. So, you know, we don't want to create a space, we don't want to antagonize, but sometimes there's relational agitation that goes on in interactions with funders around how maybe narrowly they may be viewing the work. So for example, like I mentioned with our living wage work, there's a priority with the funder around funding, getting more people in jobs. However, our work is really rooted in the funding we need is for talent. And so how does that comport with the way that you are framing this funding opportunity? And we've been able to find a fit when we've just really laid out and given more context to it.
Thank you, Chevron. So not being afraid of the conflict and leaning into that, right? Saying, hey,
Yes.
this is what I need.
If I'm teaching relationality, and if I'm teaching that tension is a necessary and positive thing, you know, done properly, then I'm also doing that with funders as well.
And then I didn't want to miss John. I know, John, you wanted to add.
Yeah, 2 quick points. I mean, one is, you know, foundations from my experience, you know, live in the same world we do. And so whether it's the post George Floyd sort of racial justice moment, whether it's even going back over the last 10 years, there's been a shift. So when foundations shift who's on their board, who's on their staff, who's their ED, and the grant requirements and what they're looking to fund, it creates new openings. And I think there's been a lot of movement there. I know I met David. I think I was on a board for a little while, but there's other folks floating through there. So that represents some level of shift. And sometimes a foundation needs external pressure. I guess this is the tension that was just mentioned here. So sometimes they need some tension. So, you know, Amazon, not to pick on them, but, you know, I can't see who's in the audience, so hopefully Jeff's not listening in here. But basically, Amazon, when they moved their headquarters here to Arlington, Virginia, they're getting $759 million in subsidy from the state, and then a couple million from the local government. And then they set up a housing equity fund, which immediately became the largest funder of nonprofit housing in the area. They are at the commanding height of the entire nonprofit affordable housing market. And they were funding, the good thing they were funding the projects they did were set aside for 99 years, which is amazing, unheard of, great progress. The bad thing was they were all funded at people earning 60% of AMI and above. The communities we organize and most like sort of working class, you know, frontline workers are all at 40% of AMI or below. So we're entering into a process of tension where we're going to be trying to say they need to actually figure out how to serve the actual most compelling need, and not what, you know, not the need of maybe their mid-level office workers, but actually the income needs of working people, mostly working people of color that surround their future headquarters.
You know, just thank you, John, because for the audience who doesn't know how Arlington is, where you live, it's one of the more expensive areas. So, you know, for most of you, for most of us, we hope that we can make 60% of that area and afford housing in this area, which is skyrocketing. I think the other thing that, John, I want to emphasize, you said earlier, was that it's, you know, knowing your power and understanding you have power in the situation as well. I just didn't want to lose that earlier point.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you again to our esteemed panelists, and we will see you all next time. Be well.